So we try to keep up the high standards of the last panel, which I thought was terrific. This is on another point in this ecological system of scientific reproduction, the legal infrastructure, and how this would enable compliance with norms of scientific practice. We're looking at gatekeepers such as institutional review boards and other legal structures. I'll just leave it at that. We have Scott Patton, a clinical trials disclosure manager at Stanford. Sean Grant, assistant professor, Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Indiana University, School of Public Health. And then Tracy Teal here, executive director. She'll tell you what the carpentries is when it's her turn, but we will learn. And Mario Biagioli, distinguished professor of law and communications at UCLA and at Stanford Center for Advanced Study this year. So as with the last panel, 5 minutes for each person to just give a sense of where you come into this, this realm, and then opening it up for a discussion with the whole group. So why don't we start off with Scott?
Great, thank you so much. So I did have a slide, if we can pull that up. So it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. At Stanford, we had a kind of forcing function which got us to pay attention more to clinicaltrials.gov results. It was an article that came out in Stat, and so at that time, we had a lot of late results, and there was already in process of formulation of the Clinical Research Quality Office, which also has regulatory services. And into that got folded some support, infrastructure support for clinicaltrials.gov reporting. And as that was being established, there was some cooperation between the IRB and the grants office and senior management and clinical research quality to create a policy for clinical trials disclosure on clinicaltrials.gov. That was very helpful because it gave us something to work from. We promoted cooperation. I have to say that's top down. That was because we had a champion in the senior associate dean for research who said, get this done. And that really promoted interdepartmental cooperation. There was a lot of hands on deck. We implemented reporting. We had an Excel guru in our grants office. They were paying attention to this space already. He was able to take the publicly downloadable data and the PRS data, that's the data that only we can see when we're working with data prior to its release to clinicaltrials.gov. We download all that to come up with reporting and to show where we're late and where actions are due soon. So then there was also this administrators group, as you can see, that got involved. So these are people who are pretty high-level administrators within the larger departments especially, and they had a lot of work to do, and so there was this effort to really address this backlog of results. Now, that was what happened when this whole thing was a big problem, and since then we've done a lot to reduce our rate of late results. We, I believe, have 4 or 5 now out of our hundreds of reportable studies by this time, and that's a lot better. It's not perfect, but it's better. But what the structure is still in place. We still have the policy. We still have some interdepartmental cooperation. It's not as necessary now. People aren't behind the 8 ball. So a lot more has fallen to CRQ to provide some impetus to keep things going. So we disseminate information on applicable requirements that come up through the administrators group. We continue to report to the department chairs on activity in their department, and we work directly with investigators to help them post their results. There's some limitations. There's more to be done. We're a small office, so it gets down to a question of priorities. How much can we put behind this? So we're very good with results, but we have a lot of registrations that could use some work. We heard from another speaker, from our last speaker at the AEA Registry, that there are studies that have passed their completion date that still show as active. This is a kind of common problem. So it comes down to a question of resources and priorities, like what will we go after? And then what we do and what we don't support. So I put in here this graphic, which is adapted from Deborah Zarin's article. Deborah Zarin was the director of clinicaltrials.gov since its foundation through several years. She only recently stepped down. She's at the MRCT?
Multi-Region Clinical Trials Network?
Yeah, exactly. She moved over there, and she's a champion now for, so watch for her in this space. But there's the three tiers. There's the registration, which lets you know that things have been done. It also gives you specify what your outcome measures are going to be ahead of time, right? And that is part of the big forcing function for clinicaltrials.gov was this enormous publication bias, right? And selective outcome measure switching, cherry picking of outcome measures. And so this idea of saying what they're going to be in when you register is extremely important. And then the results should show that, where there should be a trail linking to if there have been changes. So it all of this depends on a well-developed protocol, right, with the pre-planned methods. Now, the place where the third tier is the individual participant data, and there's a lot of issues around that. You'll see that the medical journal editors recently came out with a policy asking whether you'll share this data. They aren't requiring it yet. There's many NIH policies requiring data sharing. There's some other policies that, like in the EU, that haven't quite yet been implemented. There's industry efforts to do it already in place. So there's a lot of this going on already, but it's not a place where, at this point, we have I'm not involved in CRQ in supporting how that gets done. So I did want to mention, since they had come up in previous conversation, I would love to see a fine in a way. I know I shouldn't say that because that would come against my, well, hopefully not against Stanford, but it would really provide a lot of impetus. But the problem is that it has to go through the regular process of an FDA inspection, and so you would actually have a chance to correct the record prior to implementation of a fine. So that's something to think about. And also just to mention, as was discussed before, about publication and the impact of posting information on a registry, especially the results information. The medical journal editors have stated in their clinical trial recommendations that they don't consider a structured abstract of about 500 words or fewer, or the kinds of entries that you would have in a registry like clinicaltrials.gov and the results portion. They do not consider that to be prior publication. I have actually been in conversations with one of the editors at New England Journal of Medicine, and they said that they don't want to interfere with any statutory guidelines, right? But then the question came, like in the lay summaries that are going to be required in European Union, would those be considered prior publication? And she said, well, we'll look at it. You know, is it a short 500-piece abstract, or are you writing a paper on it, right? And so, again, it would, from their point of view, it had to do with they don't want to get in the way of statutory requirements. So I think that's good for me for now.
Sean?
Sure. Great. So I want to thank BITS for having me, NSF for supporting, and then also the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, because I'll be talking about some work I did from a research project that they funded on this topic, and tomorrow I'll actually be discussing at the annual meeting some survey and interview results that mimic actually something a colleague of mine did with CT.gov administrators on that side. So watch this space. So what I'll be talking about is a summary from an opinion piece I have in PNAS. So if, Alex, you can pull it up, or if you want to Google it, then you can zone out for the next 5 minutes and I can talk to you about it later. But taking this approach of a systems approach to engaging stakeholders like scientific journals, funding agencies, and professional societies to realign the research enterprise to openness, I'd today like to make the case that institutional review boards, or IRBs, research ethics committees, are an often overlooked yet critical stakeholder group for open science proponents to engage. One reason IRBs can require modifications to and even disapprove data sharing plans based on information in the application, protocol, and informed consent forms that investigators submit for IRB review. Conversely, IRB workflows themselves can increase if a greater number of people are submitting studies that require higher levels of IRB review because they're proposing to share data that risks disclosure of identifiable private info about living human beings And I think I want to add to that, those who might not be used to doing that are probably going to propose things that might be risky, at least at the outset. A lot of focus on this aspect of the research ecosystem has been on educating study investigators about their responsibilities to protect human research subjects. And while that's incredibly important, I think IRBs themselves need to be informed about open science practices and the impact of their growth on IRB responsibilities to protect human research subjects. In other words, IRB members and professionals themselves should be part of this movement towards open science. One thing I want to say, I think in terms of framing, is that while it's accurate to consider IRBs as ethics bodies that are concerned with moral obligations, I think it's best in this context to understand them through a regulatory lens. That is, they are principally compliance offices, and their responsibility is ensuring that an institution's federally funded human subject research is compliant with specific federal regulations. Institutions can assign additional responsibilities to their IRBs, yet even in these instances, federal regulations strongly influence IRB operations for human subject research at that institution. Furthermore, this movement towards open science is gaining traction a long time, really historic, as in has not happened in 40 years until a year or two ago. Historic regulatory changes to the IRB ecosystem that have privacy, confidentiality, and reduction of IRB overreach and administrative burdens as their core goals. So as a result, IRBs will likely be resistant to open science reform efforts, even those that are based on ethically sound arguments, if they risk breaches of privacy and confidentiality, if they risk IRB overreach, or if they risk unnecessary burdens on IRB administration, because those are the priorities in their regulatory context and their job context that they're facing right now. So I think first and foremost, IRB functions and operations that aim to enable open scientific research must avoid noncompliance with the common rule, which are the federal regulations for the protection of human subjects in research. The regulations that are most relevant to open science are concerned with minimizing the risk of harm that results from breaches in privacy of subjects and confidentiality of data, and these regulations are a top priority for IRBs. So in light of this, I think investigators who plan to use open science practices would benefit from a few things, concrete things from IRBs, namely procedures, guidance, templates, and expertise that clarify how to practice open science while remaining compliant with the common rule. So for example, if we're talking about procedures, study proposal forms and submission systems could include a specific field for each open science practice of interest so that IRBs could systematically collect this information from investigators in their review of research, and it nudges investigators to think about them at the onset of their study research cycle. To assist investigators developing proposals, IRBs can also create written guidance that explains how certain open science practices like data sharing can escalate the level of IRB review and potentially prevent IRB approval. At a minimum, this needs to address, if we're looking at the regulations, what is identifiable private information in biospecimen. A new emphasis is on analytic techniques or technologies that generate themselves identifiable private information, exemption categories that have criteria related to the identifiability of subjects, and adequate procedures that protect the privacy of subjects and maintain confidentiality of data that is compliant with the regulations but allows investigators to do that to a certain degree. Part of this needs to include templates for informed consent in the new broad consent category that have approved language from the IRB saying that you can share data, code, and materials, especially language about confidentiality of records and future research use, because without this you might not be able to do that. And to fill in gaps, thinking about interpretation of application, IRBs can invite experts in some of these open science practices and data matching and these analytic techniques for re-identification, either as standing members of the IRB or as consultants who assist on a case-by-case basis. And there's precedent for this in the regulations themselves. Second, we need to be considerate of the Belmont Report, which are the ethical principles that the common rule is based on. They not only serve as a foundation for, but they also provide the analytic framework that IRB members use to guide the resolution of ethical issues. They're not explicitly covered in the regulations. So some of the things that I discussed above speak to interpretations of these principles that actually might constrain the use of open science practices. So we're thinking about respect for persons. subjects in the informed consent forms need to have the opportunity to choose the extent to which their data can be shared. And beneficence, in part, involves assessing risks that may occur from privacy and confidentiality breaches. But at the same time, when findings are not made public, the main focus of this meeting, or other products of research like data are not shared, the subsequent loss of generalizable knowledge from research can also be interpreted as violating these principles, especially if the human subjects who chose to participate in a research project chose to do so because they wanted to contribute to the furthering of our generalizable knowledge. So I think while we can see some interpretations that provide caution, I think it's fair to interpret some of these ethical principles as actually supporting IRBs have some responsibility to support open science practices. The last thing I want to end on is if we're thinking about the wider ecosystem, much like there are groups that influence us as researchers and influence our research or professional behavior, there are organizations that directly influence IRBs who could help refine and clarify their role in this movement towards open science. One is the Office for Human Research Protections, who is responsible for ensuring that human subject protection regulations are appropriately and effectively applied, and specifically to changing needs of the research community. And I think that the open science movement definitely qualifies as one of those changing needs. In addition, there is a program of accrediting human research protection programs. It's AAHRPP. I won't spell it out because alphabet soup, but you can Google that. And then there's a certification program for IRB professionals. They could incorporate standards or competencies into their certification and accreditation programs related to open science that is relevant to an IRB professional. So I think, in summary, I want to advocate for thinking about IRBs as another group, at least if we're targeting institutions to be part of that institution that we engage with in this movement, not only because it will facilitate the contribution of open science to better science, but I think it also maintains continued public trust in the research enterprise by protecting its most important stakeholders, namely the members of the public who participate in our research.
Very interesting. Tracy, you're on. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much. So thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. So first, yes, I'll introduce what the Carpentries are. So the Carpentries is a nonprofit organization teaching researchers how to work more effectively and reproducibly with data and code. And so not to throw around the term paradigm shift, but I will use it anyway. We really are in the last maybe 10 years or so in a paradigm shift around the types of data that researchers are using, the sort of 3 V's, the volume, variety, and velocity of data that researchers are producing is unprecedented. And so that's part of why we're having these conversations here, is that this data isn't really the bottleneck as much anymore to our research. There's so much of it available, but we're struggling to figure out what to do with it in terms of how we work with it in our research. How do we share it? What are things to think about with privacy? It just really changes how we think about a lot of things in our work. And as active researchers, we haven't necessarily had the training in what we need to do with this data. So if we're thinking about the data-driven discovery and data-enabled research as the house, what the Carpentries does is we try to teach researchers how to use the tools to build the house. So those are things like learning how to program, or learning what it means to think about data privacy, or what's raw data versus processed data. How do you store it? There's so many things now that we need to think about as researchers that we didn't need to think about before. So I'm really excited to be on this panel in particular around the word enabling, because we talked a lot about the compliance side and the sort of, I would say, the perceived stick of legal compliance, whether or not you want to think of legal compliance as a stick. I think to a lot of researchers it seems more sort of, to use Celia's terms, around policing or punitive. But how is it that we can empower researchers to do this? So if we live in, say we live in a world, which I'm sure will be tomorrow, where everybody agrees that this is the thing that we need to do, right? That we should be sharing our data and pre-registering things, and whether they believe that because it's for the common good, or they think it's good research, or they're complying with some kind of research standards. How do we get there? How do we help people feel empowered and enabled to do this work? So if you're thinking of yourself or people you work with, how many people you think in this space feel like today they know how to do this work, that they feel excited and empowered? Raise your hand if that's your colleagues, excited and empowered. How about fearful? How many people feel like their colleagues are in that category? So somewhere in between. So I'll say, my background is in metagenomics and genomics, and I started, I was working in bioinformatics at Michigan State University, and a researcher, he's been working on a plant gene his entire career, and finally went and got the genome sequenced, and he was so excited, right? Because like, this is your life's work. You've been studying things like gene by gene or region by region, and you get to have the whole genome. So he sent it off, he got it sequenced. I talked to him, came back, few months later, hard drive in his hands. And he says, now what? He was not excited to receive this hard drive. He was instead, didn't know where to start. He was fearful. Someone who is an expert in their field. And so we're putting people who are experts back in this position of being novice learners. And so how do we onboard people to these practices? And so I would argue that is through education and providing training opportunities in how to be compliant. So I love what you're talking about with the IRB, with the how to, right? It's onboarding people. What's the template that someone can use? How do you approach this perspective so that researchers feel like this is something that they can do and not something necessarily that they have to do, that it benefits their work, that it benefits research as a whole, that and their team. And so another piece of that is, okay, and I will also say the super awesome thing about training is that people want it. So when there was a survey of Bioinformatics Resource Australia, and they said, what are the top things that this group can do for you? And they had funding and fellowships and space, and more than 50% of the respondents said training. This is the only survey I've ever seen where people wanted something more than money. And so there is this demand now because we are in this space for this training. So if we can build training that both satisfies this, now I can analyze my data also with this idea of how can I be compliant? How can I meet these standards? How can I be a part of this research ecosystem in a responsible way? And so that's a great opportunity that we have. And so how do we construct that training? The way that we think about it, we do 2-day workshops. We think about it as needing to be accessible and applicable and active. So accessible means that as an active researcher, I'm not going to take a semester-long class. I'm not going to go get a data science degree, right? I need something that I can do during my day-to-day work, right? And I needed something that can be available now. Applicable. I need something that is tied to what I'm doing now. What is the kind of data that I have? What are my needs right in front of me? That's what we say, motivated by frustration. I have this problem that I need to solve and I don't know how to solve it. How can I solve that? So applicable to the kinds of problems that we have. And then active. We know that people learn best when they're able to engage in the learning process. And so just standing up in front of the board and like walking through some code is not going to make people learn, give them the opportunity to feel like this is something that they can do. And so kind of the last piece that wraps all that together is really creating an inclusive training environment. And I'll just kind of wrap up with this perspective of, so if we reflect back on our lives learning experiences, how many people in this room have been in a course or a workshop where they felt like they didn't belong? How many people then walked away from that activity or that learning? So if we're creating learning opportunities that are turning people away from learning these things, we're never going to get to this place where we have compliance, because people are going to be afraid and not feel like it's something that they can do or have the tools to do. When we're creating these learning opportunities, they need to be a place where people feel like they belong and that they can do this work and that we can work together towards these goals that we all have together.
Thank you. Mario?
Alex, may I have the 1 second slide? So I am going to, the next one, please. Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to show you some examples of a new trend in scientific misconduct and fraud, and then make a case why it's relevant to the conversations we're having here. So broadly speaking, these examples amount to what I call post-production misconduct. That is, it is a brand new type of misconduct, I believe, because it's not about producing false statements, within the publication. So they are not about falsification or fabrication of data or plagiarism. They are about manipulating the publication so as to maximize its impact and its metrics indicators. So, fake peer reviews. I submit a manuscript to Alex's journal, and Alex asked me for a couple of names of potential reviewers, and I give him, email addresses of real people, except that they're not institutional addresses; they're like gmail.com, and I have opened those accounts. So you see where it goes. About 600 articles have been retracted as a result of these fake peer reviews, and I think that's pretty much the tip of the iceberg. Citation larceny. This came up maybe a month ago. I mean, it was well known, but there was a bigger study that came up a month ago, I think was in Science. So peer reviewers, they're asked, excuse me, they're asked to, submit provide a referee report, and they effectively ask the author to add citations to the reviewer's work. In the past, we thought that this would happen occasionally, maybe 1 or 2 citations, but we're talking about over 30 citations per peer review. Okay. Sometimes editors do that, not just peer reviewers, journal editors. Making up co-authors, this is something I find really entertaining. Typically this is done by people in second-tier institutions who feel that their stationery is not going to give enough visibility to their submissions, and the editor might just junk the manuscript without sending it out for review. So what they do is that they make up co-authors, and then they give those co-authors really nice institutional affiliations. So you have John Doe at Caltech, Jane Doe at Cambridge, and so on. So notice that this is not plagiarism, because sometimes these people are made up. But even if they're real, you are actually giving them extra authorship credit. You're not taking their work away from them. Actually, you are crediting them for something that they have not done. So this is effectively the closest thing I can think of it is passing off in trademark law. You produce a fake Prada bag, and you attribute it to Prada, and you sell it. Prada is not terribly happy about that attribution, but it's not plagiarism. It's a passing off. Okay. Selling authorship. There are a number of cases that have come up that sometimes this kind of media services, especially in biomedicine, so the kind of editors that help out not native English speakers to edit their work, what they do sometimes, they actually write articles, they submit them, and in between, and so suppose they're lucky, they get revised and resubmit or accepted with revisions. In that interval, you can actually change the authorship byline. And so they say, we have, an article accepted for publication in the New England Journal of Medicine, $20,000, and you are a co-author. So they sell the authorship slots for cash because they can still do those kind of revisions. Okay, so you see that in these cases I've given you, there is no manipulation of the content of the publication. So this is not traditional fraud, so which I call epistemic fraud, meaning fraud that involves falsehood about the claims about nature. There is plenty of falsehood here, but it's not about the claims of the article. So why is this interesting? And the reason why it's interesting is that this is beyond, okay, this escapes peer review. Because typically peer review is how you caught this, how you caught fraud. Because peer review had access to the text where the fraud could have happened. Instead, here, most of these kind of frauds do not happen in the text. The traces, the forensics, has to be done on the data, on the publishers' databases, platform. So this is an example. This came out in 2014 as part of the fake peer review investigation. So you see that, 14 months investigation, 20 people involved from SAGE. So they had access to all the document, all the ether of the submission. So wording of reviews, details of author-nominated reviewers, reference list, so to see the citations that may have been tweaked, and turnaround time for reviews. And that's how they got, this is how they got the fake peer reviews. Because the fake peer reviews, you are not going to catch them normally, except that these guys got so cocky that they would get the request from the journal to review their own work, and they already had the review ready, and they would send it out right away. And so they got caught because they noticed that some of the reviewers were coming in within minutes of the request going out. Without this evidence, it would have been very difficult to find the stuff. So you see what I'm saying. The forensics of this new kind of law cannot be based on traditional peer review. The problem is that all the evidence is in these proprietary databases. And the journals are notoriously disinclined from telling us what happens as they manage the publications. I mean, if any of you has worked on retractions, you know that retractions are incredibly information-starved. The retractions for fake peer reviews would be, we're retracting this article because there was a violation of peer review protocols, period. There were no details, okay? So, how can we go around this? So, and this is something I've concocted for this workshop, so it's not profound, but I'm interested to know your response. So, I assume that journals are not going to let us access their platforms and mine data there. But perhaps we can ask them to make public some specific information that may not be identifying, so we stay clear of issues of privacy. But so basic things like, give us the timeline of the submission processing. Was the author list or the order of authorship modified? Did reviewers ask for citations to their work? What kind of emails were used? So these are kind of things that would not necessitate access to the platform, but would give us something to work with. So this would be, the granularity would be lousy, but you can still detect patterns. And then based on those patterns, one can pose more specific queries to the journals. If you want to see some more entertaining examples of these recent trends in misconduct, which are really quite spectacular, I have a book coming out in a month from MIT Press on gaming the metrics.
Thank you.
It's expensive, though.
Before we open up, I've One question for Scott. What would it cost, both in time, money, and energy, for CRQ to be a part of a university superstructure for all disciplines? Would this be something that is feasible in the institutional space of our research universities?
Well, I think yes, that it is feasible. It just depends on the priority of the institution. So actually, I support investigators in all 7 schools at Stanford, not just the School of Medicine. It's just that the way that Stanford is set up is that almost all of the trials in clinicaltrials.gov are from the School of Medicine, right? But the cost would be basically the cost of the people to do the work, I think. And there's a hidden opportunity cost that you gain when, and I've seen this a lot, where I give hours and hours and hours back to investigators by helping them, because particularly with results submission, it's so complicated, and they don't do it often enough. It's not worth it to, like, I mean, I try to train, some people are adept, and I am able to train some people, but most people don't retain it. And so, so there's I think I earn my keep, even though we can't be shown to pay for ourselves, right? And also, how it gets funded is different at every institution. Where it might sit is different in every institution. The reason why I think this wound up in CRQ is because the director of CRQ, Jennifer Brown, she is the expert on clinicaltrials.gov, and so it made sense for it to reside in her office. But it could easily reside in IRB. It could easily reside elsewhere. So, yeah. Does that?
Yes, I think that's immensely informative. Floor is open.
Hi, I just wanted to make some comments with regard to Mario's remarks. With regard to the Gmail addresses and other things that provoke suspicion, I'm sure that in many cases they merit suspicion, but being here representing Africa today, I need to point out that there are nuances. Many academic researchers, in fact most in Africa, and I'm sure elsewhere in the global south, use Gmail addresses because their institutional servers are not sufficiently robust to do the work they need to do. So just because their name is associated with the Gmail address and it's not .bw or .ke or whatever it is, doesn't mean it's fraudulent. We have this problem also with Hinari and Research for Life and people who are set up, or organizations that are set up to waive subscription fees for institutions in the global south and underdeveloped countries, in that they disallow or don't validate people who are coming in from general addresses like Gmail. But in most cases, when you're talking about the global south, they are valid addresses. They can't use their institutional addresses for practical technological reasons. The other thing I wanted to point out, I'm sure you're well aware, being from Italy, that at least traditionally in many countries, if you're a senior in an academic department and you want your name on somebody's paper, your name goes on that paper, or else you'll be cut out of the department, you won't get funding or whatever. And so we have an inverse problem, not people fraudulently invoking authors that aren't authors of the paper, but the people who want prestige and by virtue of the seniority demand the prestige of being a co-author on a paper when they don't deserve it. And thus you get department chairmen in many parts of the world with thousands of publications that they have had nothing to do with, but they're leveraging the control they have over junior people in their department by demanding authorship for everything that comes out of their department, school, or whoever they are. So beware nuances and unintended consequences of these pursuits, which, as I say, I'm sure are legitimate in many cases.
So the point taken about the Gmail account, I had not thought about it, but thank you. Concerning the second part of your comment, so yes, you're talking about gift authorship or honorary authorship. So yes, but what I'm talking about, I think, is related but profoundly different in the sense that at least my guess, and at this point it's only a guess, is that I think this pattern is emerging because these authors actually they feel that the recognition, the brand recognition of the institution is going to be more valuable than the name recognition of, say, some colleagues of them who is prominent. So I think this is a shift. This shows that the brand of the university is becoming more valuable than the individual brand of famous authors, and which I think is connected to the globalization of publications.
I understand the different,
Yeah.
are different phenomena. I'm just saying somebody's name as an author of a paper that was not an author of the paper isn't always out of malice on the part of the submitter. Sometimes it's out of malice on the part of the person whose name.
Oh, yeah. No,
Increasingly in a lot of fields, credit taxonomies and authorship roles are being adopted. I'm kind of curious what role you see that playing in your problem. In some ways, that IRB is already sort of set up for that. When you're filling out those forms, you have to detail who's going to see data, who's going to perform certain aspects of the experiments. But it seems like that could solve a lot of these issues because you would know who certain aspects of the work should be attributed to.
Yes. I mean, if those requirements are fulfilled, yes, which I'm not sure how often they are. I mean, we all know what the definition of authorship is, and obviously a lot of people go around.
I think field by field it varies, but in cases where these taxonomies are adopted, you would be able to link Jane Doe with analysis and then link to her ORCID and then see that that's a role that she has performed in different projects.
Yeah.
Not only that, but when I'm non-contributing author in the paper, say to Science or PNAS, I get a letter from them saying your name is listed for these contributions. Have you in fact made those contributions? And I have to agree that I've done that. So that's another.
Yeah, that's good.
That's another way to check for this false attribution of co-authorship.
And I was just going to add, I love the idea if a given IRB sees this as relevant to assess using formal taxonomies like the credit taxonomy so that there is some uniform language and something that collects this specific information. And just a point that I think speaks to the collective action problem that you're talking about. It really takes everybody in the ecosystem. We found that assuming that there is buy-in that certain open science practices are relevant to an IRB, either through the regulations or other things that their institution has asked them to do, by and large, most of what they do is check language. And then at continuing review, if they have it, confirm with the authors that that has been done. Auditing takes a lot of money, and when it's done, it's typically a very small subsample of what's happened. So I think it would be linking up those early in the research life cycle, nudging kind of interventions like asking using the credit taxonomy who's doing what, but then that needs to be linked up with a journal, someone else, others in the ecosystem. But I love the idea of that being in that submission system as well.
Andy.
Oh, is it? Did you want to? Okay. Just first to comment, last one, I've been a journal editor for 8 years, and I've had one author change. I never use suggested referees and so forth. So at least from my perspective, there may be problems, but it doesn't seem like a big deal to me. I mean, I don't know exactly why. Maybe my journal's not important enough for people to cheat on it. But what I wanted to respond to is that is the IRB issue. I mean, when you were talking, it kind of gave me the chills, and maybe because of my own adverse relationship to an IRB, but I think there's a more general point to be made, and maybe the Brown IRB in particular, which is one of the problems with an IRB is that they don't see things from a disciplinary perspective, right? They're dealing with all kinds of disciplines. And as a result, it's very difficult for them to sort of know what the norms and practices are of a particular discipline, so they end up doing things that don't make a lot of sense within your discipline. So, you know, it concerns me when you talk about university-wide solutions as opposed to ones that are more sensitive to the individual place. So I don't know how to reconcile those two ideas, but it did strike me as a concern with that particular model that you were pushing. Maybe you have some reactions to that.
Yeah, sure. No, great question. I think what I'm saying is that the open science movement is an ecosystem-wide reform, so anyone in the ecosystem basically probably needs to be engaged in some way, either because they can frustrate the movement or will be influenced by it, or both. IRBs are a frequent touch point for researchers at academic institutions, especially if you're doing human subjects research. And so I think it's important to think about how they might influence this movement towards open science, and then conversely seeing them as human beings and colleagues, even if it's a frustrating relationship. How is what we're doing going to influence them? And I think that from the latter angle, I think that this will increase their workload, or has the potential to. And so I think, at least from an institutional level, that's important to think about. And I think they do have the opportunity to help facilitate this. The other angle from how I'm approaching this is, how does the world look to them? And from them, it's, I think, primarily, or at least fundamentally, a regulatory aspect. So appreciating where they're coming from, so that certain arguments that I've seen in the literature, like this is an ethical issue, so IRBs should do this because they're the ethics body, I think is a little misinformed and won't go anywhere. From the disciplinary perspective, yes, disciplines differ, particular types of study practices differ, and I think this was part of the historical push to reform the common rule so there wasn't as much overreach as there has been at some institutions. From there, when it's a local cultural thing, because it's going to depend in part, like we're hearing from Stanford, how a given organization is organized and who the people are, that's perhaps where some of the recommendations of expertise in the board itself and or consultants might help in your particular instance frustrations. But I'm not saying this is an institutional issue so much as we're at institutions, there are certain groups at institutions who are influenced by or influence this. Here's one of them, here's some thoughts on it. So hopefully that helps contextualize a bit, and happy to keep chatting.
Just a quick comment, but I've had similar experiences with IRBs, and unless we can train them or educate them, this is going to lead to disaster. If we give them more responsibilities with less knowledge, and how we can teach our IRBs our separate disciplinary norms and why we adopt them, we're going to just get delays in our research which are unbearable.
Hi. Oh, is this? Yes. Jessica Spybrook. I come from the field of education. So one of my questions around IRBs is, you know, universities are one setting, but we have a lot of folks who are coming from research firms and doing a ton of work within education. And I don't understand the oversight of those IRBs. So sometimes it seems to be made up of the three people who are doing the study also act as their own IRB. So just wondered if you had any thoughts on kind of what that looks like outside of the university setting.
Yeah, so the empirical work that we've done focused just on research-intensive universities. So any of that work I haven't done. I have worked at a non-university institution before, so I'm familiar with how our Human Subjects Protection Committee was set up. And I think the underlying shared component that I can touch on is the federal requirements and regulations themselves. So if you're getting federal funding from NIH or any of the other federal departments that have signed on to the Common Rule, there are certain requirements that are applicable, and typically there's this, at least historically, a check the box function that you're making sure you're doing this for all human subjects research, whether it's federally funded or not, in order to be eligible to get federally funded research. The actual ways in which they're organized is dependent on the particular kind of institution, and you see a variety for research, even research intensive ones. A big predictor is whether they're doing clinical trials that are applicable to FDA or NIH regulations and have medical schools versus ones that are quite small, and so therefore a lot gets tacked on to the IRB simply because they're the only compliance kind of office that touch points with researchers. So all the administrators say, okay, we'll push this on the IRB, and the IRB has more and more responsibilities. And I think for what it's worth, a lot of them don't like that either. And I think to respond to these points a bit, to keep the conversation going, I'm not necessarily saying IRBs should do things beyond what their responsibilities are. I think that they, by regulation, have to do things that will influence sharing results and sharing data. And so I just think it's more useful to take a carpentry approach rather than just say, I'm frustrated and then let's see how the chips fall.
Yeah, if I could just speak to those points around training, I think, yes, absolutely. And I have been involved a little while ago about some conversations about training for people in the IRB space around data and code and what it is and how it works. But also then on the researcher side, and creating more of a shared language and a shared understanding going into these conversations rather than really kind of coming from these separate perspectives.
Anything else? Any comments from additional comments from the panel? Then why don't we break for lunch? Thank you very much.
Thank you.